Now, I want to talk about the first chapter of your book. That is the bit I want to read the title, "The Easiest Country to Get Euthanasia." So my background is philosophy,
Mhm.
uh, and I'm a student of philosophy. Now, there's the actually the one thing that I got attracted to Canada about was that Canada allows euthanasia. Actually, um, one of the reasons that attracted me was that, let's say, if tomorrow if I become physically impaired and I believe that this existence of mine is not worth it in my eyes, in my assessment, as long as I'm calling the shots, then I like the idea of a country which allows euthanasia. Now, there are religious connotations to this. I'm an atheist, but I come from a country where actually, the idea of giving up your life is very normal. In different, Indian religions, whether it's Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, uh, I not so much in Sikhism, but the other three, there is
Yes.
this concept of giving up your life because life is cyclical in Indian
Oh,
religions,
yeah.
right? You're
Yeah.
born again. It's cyclical, and so they say, oh, we're just leaving this body, we're going to come in another body. So it's
Right.
there. So I found it very fascinating that a Western country um, allowed euthanasia, but the way you've explained it, it doesn't sound that
I
great.
think, well, the majority opinion in Canada, so sort of the 80-20 issue, 80% of Canadians think the way you think, where if I am in chronic pain, terminal illness, because basically everyone I know, I'm not sure about you, but everyone I know has had a parent or an aging relative who gets a degenerative disease and just, it's Alzheimer's, and it's just a real hard road for those last 10 years. They don't know where they are. They're scared. And, it's just forever. Quality of life is dipping. And I think everyone has sort of seen that and said, there's no way in hell that's going to be me. I want a way to sort of, so I think it was a very popular issue in Canada to sort of have that option to legally sort of punch out early. So I don't think that's controversial. But what is controversial about it is the way we implemented such a system, because there's about a dozen countries around the world who have done, they call it assisted dying, they call it legal euthanasia, we call it medical assistance in dying. But when Canada brought in its system, we had people coming in from other countries that already had this, Belgium, the Netherlands, and they said, well, first of all, you got to be real careful with your checks on this, because this opens a whole can of worms. You can't just legalize assisted suicide and expect that it's going to go exactly the way you intend. This is one of those things where there are massive unintended consequences. And when you look at the origins of how we brought in our system, there was basically no imagination whatsoever that it could go off the rails, that there could be unintended consequences, that there could be bad actors. And it's actually shocking knowing what we know now. And what we know now is that Canada has had the world's fastest growing rate of assisted suicides, way faster than we assumed. We thought it was going to peter out at 2% of deaths. And within 3 years, it was 4% of deaths, and it's growing by 30% every year. And we don't see any sign of stopping. So, I mean, it could peter out at 10%. We don't have regional data because the data collection on this sucks. But in certain regions of Canada, it could be as high as 15-20%. I've heard rumors, I'm in Vancouver Island, that it is up to 1/5 of all deaths are assisted suicide. On top of that, you have all of these scandals. The most egregious of which was an instance where this is a veteran who was calling Veterans Affairs with PTSD, soliciting help for it, and in response was offered medical assistance in dying and took it. So you actually had, and so there's that, and there's just any number of these scandals. And it used to be Belgium and the Netherlands who were sort of furnishing these scandals. And Canada, it's just been dozens of those, one after the other. Now, when you look at the origins of how our system was brought into being, you'll even see it because it was legalized by a Supreme Court decision. They essentially found that it was a charter right. And it's weird when you parse the actual decision because they say Canadians' right to life guarantees a right to death. And there's sort of this very convoluted way in which they decide that. But at the end of the court decision, I mean, there was any number of experts, in this Supreme Court hearing who said you should be careful about checks. You can't make this a hard right. You've got to have sort of barriers in place. You have to have independent agencies. And they said, we don't need to worry about any of that. And I'm forgetting the exact line, but they said we cannot lightly assume that this is going to go wrong. So it's just this sort of arrogance that we're Canadians, we know what we're doing, we don't have corruption like other countries, we don't have bad actors like other countries. If we do it, it's going to work well. And thus, we have the world's most low barrier assisted suicide system, and it's acted as you would assume. It's gone in a whole bunch of directions we didn't anticipate because those checks weren't there. And this is sort of a theme throughout the book. It's just this naivete that, oh, we're Canadians, we've been well managed, we're different than other people, we don't have to worry about the problems that plague other countries. And thus, when a bad piece of policy, when a bad idea comes, we do not have the skepticism to stop it. We had zero defenses against it. So it hit us harder than anyone else.
Do you think the solution lies more in policy correction than junking the policy all by itself? Because if I was looking at it, if people are being pushed towards euthanasia at an alarming rate, or if people are picking euthanasia at an alarming rate, those are two very different scenarios, right?
Oh, yeah.
The latter is a mental health crisis in the country, a loneliness crisis in the country, and the former would be a government system that is just not able to deal with senior care. It is starved for resources. I mean, I'm just looking at the primary reasons that cause the secondary effect, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a secondary effect. What is the primary reason? That's what we should try to dissect when we're doing policy analysis as far as Canada is concerned, right?
I think it's I sort of get into this in the chapter, but just sort of, stopping that, egregious growth of MAID is actually pretty simple, because you just look at what they do in other countries, and they have two basic checks that we never even considered. One easy one is, this is what's done in the United States. First of all, you have to be terminally ill to qualify for MAID. So Canada did get rid of that with a court decision. We initially had that because I think we correctly saw that was a very good way to sort of prevent it from, extending to, you have someone deciding that, it's poverty is sort of an egregious factor enough for someone to qualify for MAID. So if you look at the United States, you can't, in the states that have it, you can't qualify for assisted suicide unless you can administer it yourself. And it's just a small change like that. But they sort of avoided, first of all, the rapid growth, and also a lot of these sort of scandal edge cases that we have gotten. Just a simple check or fix like that. Another very big one, and this is where Canada is different than any other system which does this. In most countries, the idea of a physician recommending assisted suicide unsolicited, so saying, have you considered this? That's illegal. They can actually lose their license for doing that, because, as you can imagine, it completely changes the dynamic of how you're interacting with your doctor. You're in the hospital, you think you're going to get better. A doctor comes in, you're vulnerable, you don't know anywhere to go, and a doctor suddenly, out of the blue, mentions, have you thought about killing yourself? And then, that sends you for a whole kind of a loop. Under the Canadian MAID guidelines, doctors are supposed to do that. They are instructed not assume that someone already knows about assisted suicide, and it's seen as part of the continuum of care. It's seen as no different than any other palliative care, and that's the way it should be treated. That's real weird. No one else around the world treats it like this. This is seen as sort of a civil rights issue. It's important that we have it, but it's something that exists outside the medical system. There's a very hard.
So the state is not supposed to nudge you towards it. The state is there that if you want to do it, the state's like, okay, we'll help you.
That's right. Yes, and if it is suggested, there are criminal penalties in some cases for doing that. Versus in Canada, where every doctor has read guidelines saying, if someone's in pain, just bring it up. Maybe not pressure them. But you can imagine there are any number of cases that have come to light where people have been pressured because it's quite a can of worms. And when you mix legal assisted dying with an overburdened healthcare system, again, it's baffling to go back to the origins of this policy, and no one thought, and even if they were warned about it, they thought these two things were not going to intersect. We've got a crazy overburdened healthcare system. Doctors being run off their feet, and then here's a cure. It works 100% of the time. Death, cures all, and there's no way to tell that you made a mistake.
It's because somebody just in the live stream wrote, "Well, there's no PTSD once you're dead." So, and that's it.
Yeah, the treatment worked. They are successfully dead at the end of it.
Yeah,
So
it's crazy.
it's sort of a good example. And with something, it's interesting you mentioned that, yeah, there is widespread support for a basic option to punch
Yeah,
out
I'm
at
one
a
of
certain
them.
point.
I'm one of
Yeah,
them. I support
and that's
this.
the vast majority of Canadians. And then under that rubric, that something that everybody agrees with is all of this sort of mismanagement and unintended consequences that happen very quickly, because this has only been legal, really at a large scale since 2018. So we went from no assisted suicide to the most assisted suicides per capita of any other country on earth, in weird categories and with extremely low barriers. Most places you need at least 2 doctors. There are independent verifications. There's a complaint process. None of that exists in Canada.
I'll give you an idea of how it happens in one community in India. For example, the Jain community. That actually the Jains practice this the most. They call the word in Sanskrit or Prakrit in their language is called Santara.
Mhm.
Basically, giving up your life willingly when you realize that I have done my bit, I have taken care of my family, I have done all my duties diligently towards my family, my society, towards my dharma, and now it is my time to leave. And then what they do is they slowly reduce the intake of food. So I'll give you the whole process of how it happens.
Oh, sure.
But
Yeah.
before they decide to take a Santara, it's not just the willingness or the decision of the individual who has decided to take the Santara. Is a long discussion where you have to first sit with the family, consult with the family. If the family disapproves, they don't do it. It's a very, very different system, and the government is not at all involved in it. That's the
Right.
that's the weird thing. The government is not involved. Now the Indian government has tried to make it harder that nobody just because what if people start killing their parents for property disputes or something of that sort. So the Indian government
Right.
is trying to make it harder, but it still happens in the Jain community especially, and there are media articles in India talk about this all the time. But what they do is the community is so robust that it's not so easy also to do the process of Santara in India as a Jain. It's because the community is so involved in each other's lives.
Right.
And it's actually a very unique system. I was raised in a majority Jain area while I was a Hindu growing up, and there was just Jains around me. I mean, there's barely any difference between Hindus and Jains other than a few beliefs here and there. They're all Indian religions. But it is very fascinating to me how the community input in the Jain system is so high that they do, they what you call the free rider problem in a purely evolutionary term.
Right.
They
Right.
they thought of a free rider problem, and here I think what Canada is going through is actually the free rider in this case is the state itself. It's free riding, and it's pushing people into something that they should not be doing. The state's job is to don't end your life. That should be the reaction of the state. The state's reaction should not be, hey, why have you considered killing yourself?
Yes. And I think when Canadians hear that that's what's happening, and it's often sort of hard of Canadians to sort of accept that this is happening. I mean, even just doing interviews for this book, if it's with a radio station, often the host will be getting comments, people calling in and saying, "You shouldn't be speaking to this Tristin Hopper with his Canada bashing book, very unpatriotic." That he would come in and trash this country. We are at existential threat from U.S. President Donald Trump, and we must be united. And I would argue the exact opposite. I think a lot of these problems actually got worse in the world because of that willingness to just have blinders on and not see something. And any number of times in this book, I bring up instances, whether it's a failure of the criminal justice system, whether it's a failure of the assisted suicide system, whether it's some real wacky policy in terms of gender identity. Policies that the exact same thing has been tried in other countries and was extremely controversial. And it happens in Canada and no one knows it's happening. And if they do, they just kind of move on with their lives.